Hi, everyone. Just as everyone's coming in, we're going to wait a minute or two for everyone to arrive, and then we'll start. I'm going to go ahead and start us off so that you get your full time, Jamaica. And then folks will come in, I think, as we're talking and doing some of the opening. Hi to everyone who's already with us. My name is Harper Keenan, and I'm the Robert Quartermain Professor of Gender and Sexuality in Education at UBC. And as the organizer of this speaker series, I want to begin by recognizing that UBC occupies the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And as this Zoom meeting is being broadcast all over the world, it is entering countless other Indigenous territories, and each of them have their own practices and protocols. So it's my sincere hope that all that we do together today strives to be in right relationship with each of those communities and the lands and waters to which they are connected. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reg De Silva, who's the Associate Dean for Equity at the UBC Faculty of Education. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Keenan. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Reg De Silva. I am the Associate Dean, Equity and Strategic Programs in the Faculty of Education. And I feel privileged to join you all today. Many thanks also to Dr. Keenan and his team for organizing this event. These are times when transformative education is critically important in raising awareness and bringing about much needed social change. Fear and ignorance are behind much of the hate and violence around the world. And those of us who are persons from Black, Indigenous, racialized, LGBTQ, two-spirited, or other marginalized groups especially know the dangers of ignorance and hate. So I want to welcome everyone to this first event in the Transformative Education Speaker Series. I want to also take this opportunity on behalf of the Faculty of Education to acknowledge the Robert Quartermain Professorship of Gender and Sexuality in Education held by Dr. Harper Keenan. This is a result of a long-standing relationship between UBC and Dr. Robert Quartermain, who is deeply passionate about his commitment to sexual orientation and gender identity inclusive education. The faculty is grateful to Dr. Quartermain for his generosity and his extraordinary commitment to this area of scholarship. I feel particularly honored to welcome you to this Transformative Education Speaker Series that features scholars, artists, and those working in SOGI education, racial justice, and a number of intersecting and related areas. So welcome again. And as I hand it back to Dr. Keenan to introduce our speaker, I would like to thank you again for taking the time to attend this session. Over to you, Dr. Keenan.
Great, thank you so much. And my thanks again to the team that has put this together. An event like this takes quite a bit of coordination, and I want to give a special shout out to Carla Jubeli, who is our new communications and operations assistant for SOGI UBC, and who's managed a lot of the logistics for today. We really couldn't have pulled this off without her, so we're very grateful to her. And to the TEO or the Teacher Education Office and the Office of Indigenous Education for their support of this program as well. And so with that, I also want to thank Allison of Still Interpreting for ensuring greater accessibility for this webinar today. So thank you so much, Allison. So with all that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamaica Osorio, who is a Kanaka Maoli Wahine artist, activist, and scholar, born and raised in Palolo Valley to parents Jonathan and Mary Osorio. Heoli earned her PhD in English, Hawaiian literature, in 2018 from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Currently, Heoli is an assistant professor of Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Heoli is a 3-time National Poetry Champion, poetry mentor, and published author. She is a proud past Keapuni student, Ford Fellow, and graduate of Kamehameha, Stanford University, and New York University. Her book, Remembering Our Intimacies, Mo'olelo, Aloha ʻāina, and ʻea, is forthcoming with University of Minnesota Press in fall 2021. Or actually, it's really just come out. And so many of us are waiting with bated breath for this fantastic new book that's going to make such an important impact on communities around the world. And I believe we'll be sharing links to purchase it in the comments, so look out for those. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Osorio to share with us today.
Aloha, mahalo, Dr. Keenan, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm sorry, I think I sent you an outdated bio that it keeps saying that it's forthcoming. Yes, the book is here. Very few people have it in their hands. I think by a blessing of this wonderful community, many people ordered it while they were printing it, and they kind of freaked out the publisher a little bit. So if you ordered yours and you didn't get yours yet, I'm sorry, it's coming. Yeah, my name is Jamaica Osorio. I am really, really excited to be here today. And today I want to tell a moʻolelo, a story, a history. And along with this particular story, I want to share a longer, vibrant history of my people resisting and rising against ongoing colonialism and imperialism in our homeland in Hawaii. And so today I speak as a Kanaka Maoli, a native Hawaiian, born and raised in the ʻāina, the lands that fed my ancestors. And I've really had the privilege to lend my body and my ʻike, my knowledge, to these movements. But I also want to speak to you folks as a fellow Indigenous person who hopes that sharing our story will lend solidarities to our comrades across the world. I believe in the imperative of sharing mo'olelo. I believe in the method of saying these mo'olelo and sitting in a circle with each other and telling the stories that raised us and that we've been a part of, and that can help us to commit to transforming our commitments to each other. I'm also going to share this particular mo'olelo because Canada is but one of the governments that is committed to funding the project known as the 30-meter telescope. Other countries include Japan, India, China, and of course individual public and private organizations such as the University of California School System, Caltech, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So, whether you're connected to Hawaii or not, those of you listening from territories now occupied by the Canadian government or affiliated with other funders of this project, you're connected to this story as well. And it is true, I am a Native Hawaiian and Indigenous politics professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And in particular, my research is interested in pilina, which is our word for intimacy or relatedness. And I have studied kind of ancient Hawaiian relationships as an example of relationships that exist outside of heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity. This presentation is not really going to dive so much into that research that could be more clearly qualified as gender and sexuality studies centered, although this presentation is about pilina. It is about intimacy and how intimacy is forged through story and forged through movement building. And so I think it's an important story to share. On that note, I am going to share my screen. So to just give a little bit of a background before we dive in, for those of you who may not be familiar, on July 12, 2019, 35 Kanaka Maoli gathered at Pu'uhuluhulu, which is on the island of Hawaii, to establish a pu'uhonua, a place of refuge, for Native Hawaiians in the center of the battle to protect Mauna a Wākea. Maunakea is the tallest mountain in the world when measured from the seafloor, and also the highest peak in the Pacific, and therefore is not just to Hawaiians, but to the people of the Pacific, one of the most sacred sites in the Pacific. This establishment of this place of refuge was followed closely by the creation of the Cattle Guard 8, the arrest of our elders, and the formation of what we called the Manawahine line, the line of powerful women. Together, this allowed this once very small gathering of people in this place of refuge to explode into a global movement and conversation to not only protect Mauna a Wākea, but also to advocate for the rights of Native peoples around the world, to manage our resources and to self-determine. So I'm going to begin this presentation with a mele, a song that my father taught me, and it is about this mountain. But I think it's important to start here. This song was written in the 1960s by a man named Keola Beamer, who grew up with his ohana, with his family, living in the shade of this magnificent mountain. Let me pull up my words. Okay.
Standing
Mahalo for indulging me. So the first time I remember my father singing this song was at a Maunakea community gathering in Wākea on the west side of this island in 2013. And I'm certain my father sung this song before, and I'm certain I've heard it before, but this is the first time I remember him singing the song. And as he tuned his guitar, he shared how this song was written by a high school classmate, Keola Beamer, shortly after their high school graduation. First of all, I'm in awe of someone who can write a song this beautiful at the age of 18, but we'll leave that aside for now. My dad tells us that this composition preceded any construction of any telescopes on this sacred mountain. And he says this kind of ominously as our audience braces for yet another fight against the occupying state of Hawaii. And we, as a people, collectively vow to protect our Mauna from further desecration. But when he tells us this story, I can also see him slowly conjuring the memory of the Maunakea he grew up with, because my father was born and raised on Hawaii Island as well, living in the shade of this beautiful mountain. He remembers a mountain without telescopes, without development, a mountain free from this violence. And though his memory is faded, hard to hold, stashed away and covered with decades of new images, new realities, as a Hawaiian who has lived in his one hanau, in the malu, in the shade and protection of the Mauna since his adolescence, it's beautiful to hear him share that memory with us. And at this time, it's 2013, what am I? I'm 23 years old. I'm just beginning my PhD program in the English department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I had just avoided going to law school, barely. And for a lot of reasons, this fight to protect the Mauna was, in my mind, purely political. It was a legal and political struggle. It had everything to do with legal and political jurisdiction. All we needed was to keep fighting along those lines. And I think that's because at that time I really believed that our future victories as Hawaiians rested solely in those legal and political questions. But if my time on Mauna Wākea has taught me anything, it's how much of our moʻolelo, of this story and history and mana, our power, authority, and spirituality, I was forsaking in propelling such a limited belief. And so that's really what today is about, kind of opening up our minds beyond the limited imagination of that legal story, of that very mainstream political story, to open up some room for all these other stories that have been cast aside. Because so much has changed for me and my lahui, my community, since 2013. So the pu'uhonua, I referenced this in the opening of the presentation. I want to share a few stories from the beginning days, the early days of the pu'uhonua or pu'uhuluhulu, and the intimate pilina, the intimate relationships that we cultivated in the shade of Mauna Wākea. I want to argue that this intimacy has made possible one of the greatest uprisings of my people since the 19th century. So, like I said, kind of in the opening, on July 12th, 2019, about 300 people gathered in Kona on the island of Hawaii to basically be given instructions for what was going to happen. We were told we are going to set up an encampment at the base of the mountain, at the one access road up to the summit of the mountain. And at that time, only 30 people were really ready to make that trek, to like gather all our camping equipment and go at that moment. So 30 of us made our way there, and every day kind of that engagement grew and grew and grew. On the 14th, the pu'uhonua was officially consecrated. And this is important. Pu'uhonua is not just a symbolic place of refuge. Historically, pu'uhonua were created by our ali'i, by our chiefs, to designate people and lands where anyone being prosecuted for any kind of crime, if you made your way to the pu'uhonua, you could argue your case and be spared from that prosecution. So this is a historic institution that we revived in our movement. So we consecrated the grounds, we lined the jurisdiction of this ʻāina. On July 15th, 8 protectors, Kiaʻi, chained ourselves to the cattle guard on the one road that leads up to the summit of the mountain. That engagement grew our movement from, a few dozen, maybe a few hundred people on that day to, I think there was over 1,000 people the next day. Oh yeah, that's what I say right here on this thing. And then Governor Ige then deployed 5 distinct enforcement agencies, including the National Guard, to try to remove us. And I'll talk more about what that looked like leading up to this. But this, of course, is not the first time Hawaiians had stood up and resisted development on our sacred Mauna. In fact, this particular struggle began in 1968 when the state of Hawaii, via the Board of Land and Natural Resources, issued a 65-year general lease for 13,000 acres of ceded lands. These are lands that were stolen at the time of the overthrow and the faux annexation of Hawaii. So these are lands that belonged both to the crown herself, the queen, and the kingdom. So these are seized lands that ostensibly belong to the Hawaiian people. So the BLNR gives a 65-year general lease to the University of Hawaii. This is the university I work for. They know that I'm not in agreement with their behavior on the Mauna, so there's no secret, no love lost there. And the lease was to build a single observatory. At no point in this process were Hawaiians consulted. At no point in this process did Hawaiians give consent for this observatory. That's important to note. Following the construction of this observatory, developers planned and built a number of observatories and auxiliary buildings without permits. So not even with the consent of the occupying settler state did they build these permits. And then, of course, there was public protest and outrage, so the BLNR issued back permits after the fact for the unauthorized structure. By 1983, the Maunakea Complex Development Plan was finalized, approving up to 13 telescopes by the year 2000. There are currently 13 telescopes up on that mountain. But what's important about this general lease is that it could be vacated at any time by the state for failure to properly care for the mountain. So what does that look like? Well, in 1998, the Hawaii State Auditor does a report documenting 30 years of mismanagement of the summit by both the University of Hawaii and by the BLNR. And still, the next year, 2 additional telescopes are constructed. So at this time, Native Hawaiians and our allies stood in opposition to the continued degradation of the mountain. And we utilized, all the bureaucratic means. We submitted testimony, we showed up at the courthouse, we jumped through all the fancy hoops and cut through all the red tape. And so ultimately, this development resulted in an environmental impact assessment being produced that documented the astronomy activity had caused significant, substantial, and adverse harm. You would think, okay, so they're going to stop building telescopes. Nope, sorry. Following the publication of this scathing EIS, the BLNR moved forward to approve a comprehensive management plan which made possible for the construction of an unlimited number of observatories and auxiliary structures. So when people ask, like, why are you Hawaiians so angry about a telescope? This is the corrupt history we're talking about that the 30-meter telescope corporation walked into when it applied for a permit in 2010. The TMT, as we call it now, would be the largest and most devastating structure built within the conservation use district on Mauna Kea's summit. And so there were a number of standoffs that took place, not just in 2019, but far earlier than that. In 2014 and 2015, hundreds of our people ascended the mountain to block construction. 31 protesters were arrested in 2015. In 2016, there was a second contested case hearing to fight the permits on permitting for these structures. And then in 2018, unfortunately, the state Supreme Court ruled that the TMT could proceed. And there's a really important dissenting opinion by Judge Wilson where he basically says the logic being used to propose this telescope is absolutely backwards. It has the power to undermine all of our environmental protection laws and norms, which is really important for us to understand. So between 2014 and 2019, at least 80 protectors have been arrested for this ongoing protection of this mountain. A great number of these protectors are University of Hawaii students and faculty and staff, so who are somehow related to the university that holds the master lease of this mountain. And so we've been trying to push those means too to show the university that they aren't properly representing its own constituents. Okay, so, but where is all of this, wonderful resistance coming from? It's not just the fight against this this singular telescope, right? So the movement to protect Mauna a Wākea has been made quite visible nationally and internationally. But it's important to call attention to the overall mismanagement of this mountain, to the larger practice of mismanaging Indigenous lands under the occupying jurisdiction of the state, right? And we can connect this to the issues being faced by water protectors in Minnesota, who have been fighting against the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, right? The Line 3 pipeline is a problem, but it is also just demonstrative of a whole set of other problems in terms of settler states and their misunderstanding of their responsibility to Indigenous people in our lands, right? So while the TMT has become kind of the material opponent, we have directed our struggles toward defeating. It's clear through every single stage of protest that our aim as Hawaiians reaches far beyond the blocking of a single development project. And so what do we bring with us into these battles? What has made these battles so successful for us? Well, one of these things is this idea, this practice, this belief, aloha ʻāina. And aloha ʻāina, it was reborn into the contemporary Hawaiian consciousness after 9 brave Native Hawaiians traveled to Koʻolave, this island right here, in the first stage of attempts to stop the bombing of the island that had been ongoing since World War II. In the wake of their landing, the Protect Koʻolave Ohana was formed, and in 1977, two young men who were leaders in that organization were mysteriously lost at sea while trying to save the lives of their comrades who were on the island while it was being bombed. But ever since this movement, ever since these aloha ʻāina, these folks are also from the Protect Koʻolave Ohana, aloha ʻāina has informed every battle that we've fought. These days, aloha ʻāina has been translated by scholars to mean love for the land, love for one's country, patriotism. But unlike patriotism, it's the recognition of a reciprocal and genealogical relationship that distinguishes aloha ʻāina from other forms of nationhood and nationalism. And that's really the important, intimate part of this mana'o, of this idea, is that to celebrate our ʻāina, to celebrate our land and one's personal and intimate relationship with her, offers a counter epistemology to Western nationalism, a counter gender and relational matrix that in other places, including in this pretty book, I call it an upena of pilina. So where, if not from kind of Western reductions of aloha ʻāina into patriotism, if we're not going to learn about what aloha ʻāina means from that, then where do we look? We need to look to our moʻolelo. We need to look to our traditional stories and the things written in our own language. And so this is one good example of that. In 1895, just 2 years after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, Joseph Nawahi, who was a fierce aloha ʻāina, he wrote a series of articles in this new newspaper that he created called Ke Aloha ʻāina, and he defines aloha ʻāina for us. He says, "O ke aloha ʻāina oia ka ume magineti lo ka puʻuwai o ka lahui." I won't read the whole thing. It's there in Hawaiian. Essentially, he's saying aloha ʻāina, he relates aloha ʻāina to the powers of a magnet. In this description, we learn how aloha ʻāina articulates not only a magnetic force that draws our people to our land, but it also creates and maintains an intimate relationship between people and land and all the people who love the land. So later on in this phrase, he says, if you hold up one aloha ʻāina magnet next to another aloha ʻāina magnet, they are bound fully together and they cannot be separated. And so this is another way for us to think about not just nationalism, but for us to think about what the foundational principles are in the way that we relate to each other. What Nawahi is teaching us is that the way we love each other is learned from the way we love land. And the love we have for land actually compounds our love for each other. And this aloha ʻāina, this kind of defining of aloha ʻāina, offers a small peek into the intimacy of aloha. And aloha is this idea and this word that has been so successfulully appropriated by the masses, right? So successfully stolen in order to sell Hawaii to, you know, multinational corporations, and then of course to tourists to kind of keep capitalism churning in Hawaii in a particular way. But when we look at aloha ʻāina really closely and we take seriously that the ʻāina is the carrier for the love we have for each other, it changes our approach to thinking about what aloha can mean. When we established the Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu in 2019, aloha ʻāina was a concept was pretty common for our people. You know, we heard it in schools, we hear it in our music. You can hear people, there's like stickers on the back of people's cars, right? It's not an elusive term, but for many of us who joined this movement, it was the first time we ever joined a real frontline movement. And so it was our first experience with the extreme intimacy that would be forged between ourselves, kind of in those lines, but also ourselves and our distant ancestors, who are kind of joining us for this aloha ʻāina struggle. But practicing and taking seriously aloha ʻāina doesn't just bring protectors of Maunakea into a contemporary genealogy of struggle and Hawaiian activism. It also binds us to an ancient pilina, to our kupuna and moʻolelo, and to our elders and stories. And I would argue that this is probably, you could make a similar argument for most Native people who are standing up against the tyranny of American occupation and settler colonialism today, that we're not making something out of nothing. We are engaging in an ancient struggle for our freedom and our liberation. And so this was shown most clearly in our example that we're talking about today through the proliferation of traditional ʻike, traditional knowledge that was shared on the Mauna. So the entire time we had the encampment, which ran for about 9 months between July of 2019 all the way up until March of 2020, when COVID kind of forced us all to go home and take care of each other by being away from each other. Every single day there was protocol ceremony on the mountain twice a day. At sunrise and sunset, everyone got together and we chanted our chants, we prayed our pule, and we danced traditional dances that honored the true jurisdiction of that place, like the akua, the gods and the ancestors who were the real governors of that ʻāina. So that's one of the biggest examples of like, what's the relationship between moʻolelo and movement? That right there held the movement together. It was a reminder every day why we were there, and what empowered us to be there and say that we had a right to determine what was going to happen to this ʻāina, because we were the ones who still maintained a relationship with the real ali'i, right? The real chiefs of that ʻāina, which are the gods who still live there. But there was also another really powerful story that I think informed a lot of our struggle, and that is the moʻolelo of the Kana Waima Malahoi. And as the story goes, during an expansion expedition in Puna, Kamehameha Paiʻea, who was, some of you might be familiar with his name, he is the one who is said to have, who has conquered all the islands or unified all the islands in Hawaii in the late 1700s. But he was kind of arbitrarily chasing after these fishermen, and when he was doing this, he tripped and his foot got stuck in the lava rock. And so one of the fishermen came back with his paddle. He had a like a hoiva'a, he had, I don't know, yeah, he had a paddle, and he smashed it on the head of the ali'i, of the great chief, the mo'i Kamehameha. And then he ran off. And this kind of offense, I mean, if you look at the kapu, the sacredness of our ali'i at this time, even just casting a shadow on Kamehameha could lead to your death. Certainly smashing a paddle against his head was going to lead to this person's death. But instead of seeking out this fisherman, Kamehameha looked inward and realized that he was in the wrong for arbitrarily chasing these fishermen. And so he instated the Kana Waima Malahoi, in which he says, e nā kanaka, e mālama o ko i ke akua, e mālama hoʻi ke kanaka nui a me ke kanaka iki, e hele ka ele makul e alua hine a me ke kama a moi ke ala, a he mea nānai hoʻopili kia, hewa no make. And in this kanawai, he's literally saying, to you people, take care of the god Kukaʻiri Moku, which was his war god, and take care also of those people, great and small. Allow the elderly men and elderly women and the children lay in the streets without fear of harm. No one should disturb them. And then the last line, which isn't on this slide, hewa no make, disobey and you shall die. This kanawai is often referred to as Hawaii's first human rights law. And so a lot of people today turn to this moʻolelo for guidance on how our leadership should protect and serve its most vulnerable communities. This story has also been grossly misappropriated by the Honolulu Police Department. They wear the image of the splintered paddle on their badges. They wear these badges as they sweep encampments of unsheltered Native Hawaiians from our ancestral lands. They wear these badges when they haul away Hawaiian elders in ceremony blocking desecration. They wear these badges when they try to remove us who have laid in the streets, saying we should not fear harm. So this moʻolelo reminds us that our stories aren't just metaphors, right? We don't just use these to draw out and extrapolate so that the settler state can make its enforcement policies look like it's in alignment with our cultural values. It's not just Hawaiian wrapping paper, right? We can't go out into Indigenous communities and ask them for, can you give us some terms, some language, some thoughtful sayings to, I don't know, name our department after and put into our, our mission and vision statement. Like, that's not how these stories work. The stories have to be internalized. They have to guide the way that we interact in the world. And this particular story, this particular kāna wai, people translate kāna wai to law, but it's really so much more than just the law. This is a story that its power lies indisputably in the land that it was birthed from. And it reminds us that our stories can give life and they can take life. And so as thousands of our people gathered on the Alahulukupuna, also known as the Maunakea access road, we reflected on this moʻolelo, and we reflected on the moʻolelo we were told during ceremony, and we practiced this kāna wai every day. When I look back, I think about how we had built and developed all these abolitionist institutions, even though we didn't call them that, right? That supported the adherence to this story, right? We created the Hui Kupuna Kako, the group that would take care of the elderly. We had the Mauna Medics Hui, which is the group that took care of all of our physical, mental, and emotional well-being. We had the Kapu Aloha Kiaʻi, which were, some people have reduced this to like our security force, but that's a really bad reduction. They were there to make sure we were all safe, but they certainly weren't security. They were not police in any sense, and they were certainly not made to model as police. And then we even created a Pu'uhuluhulu University, a place to care for our intellect and our na'auao. Yes, shout out to the Mauna medics because they kept us all alive. The well-being of every single person, Hawaiian or not, even the police, right? We looked out for the well-being of the folks who were there to remove us, was seriously considered and invested in, just as Kamema had instructed. So as such, the movement to protect Maunakea is not just a movement to protect our ʻāina. It's not just a movement that's anti-development, although we are anti-development. It's a movement that was rapidly growing because our investment and protection in each other, right? That intimacy became the center of the work. And it's a movement that brings us in closer alignment to the principles and values of our elders, right? That aloha ʻāina. One of the many examples of this, I alluded to this earlier, of course, is the Cattle Guard 8, right? So these folks, it was myself, the wahine who eventually became my partner, my colleague Noigadir Ka'opua, her partner, Imai Kalani Winchester, Walter Ritty, who was one of the original occupiers of Kaho'olawe in the 1970s that were blocking the bombing of that island, along with Kaleikoa Ka'eo, and I'm sorry, I'm so bad with names, Mahiai Dochin and Kamuala Park. We laid chain to this cattle guard for 12 hours from like approximately 2 a.m. on July 15th till 2 p.m. That day. And in that time, and that was really the time when we took over that road, when we said, like, this is our jurisdiction. And since that time, up until, of course, COVID, every single evening, some of our most powerful and fragile members of our community literally slept in that street. We built a tent, we put cots there, we got some heated lamps, and our elders slept in the freezing temperatures while our young devoted themselves to caring for their well-being and safety. We were living out our story in real time while our leadership spent their time planning our removal and spent something like $12 million trying to remove us. So 2 days later, as I mentioned earlier, on July 17th, 2019, 38 of our elders stood fiercely in their aloha ʻāina and were hauled away by state and Hawaii county enforcement officers. Hundreds of thousands of people watched this on Facebook Live and Instagram Live feeds, while nearly 1,000 protectors lined the road and flooded this area with our mana and our tears. As the police took our kupuna, this was the really amazing part. When they took our elders, each time an elder was taken, another elder sat down in their seat. And so the police were prepared for, you know, maybe 10 or 11 of them, because that's how many folks we thought were going to be ready to be arrested. But every time someone was removed, another elder was moved to take that space. And you could really see our moʻolelo playing out in real time, right? That they were seeing their kuleana, their responsibility and privilege, that this was going to be their moment to stand up and live as the kupuna that they always were destined to be. And when the last kupuna was hauled away, and this is, you know, this picture I think is really important because it just shows you how outrageous of an enforcement engagement was instilled on these days. We've got Honolulu Police Department, Maui Police Department. These guys don't even live on the island that this engagement is taking place. We've got Hilo Police Department, Hawaii Island Sheriff Department. The National Guard is not in these pictures. They were further down on the road. They didn't directly engage with us. And then there was the AG's office and the DLNR police were all there with their riot gear, with like 6-foot-long batons and their face shields before face shields were a COVID thing. And their LRAD, their long-range acoustic device, and tear gas and all of that stuff, all to remove elders and children from their ancestral homeland. And so when the last kupuna was removed, our manawahine, our powerful woman, took the road, and our mahu, our queer and trans people, joined us, and our kane, our men, stood at our backs, and we sang, and we cheered, and we danced hula, and we offered poetry, and we stood at the face of these police, and we reminded them that we were there for our children and for their children, and we held tightly onto each other. And it was in those moments, I think, we realized that we would protect each other as fiercely as we would protect our Mauna. We understood in that moment that the one and the two were the same. And so for so many of us, the meaning of aloha ʻāina transformed in that day. The next day, the number of kiaʻi who gathered, the number of protectors who gathered at the puʻuhonua tripled. And day by day, we grew to the greatest activation of our people since the anti-annexation petition drive in 1897, when nearly 100% of our ancestors signed petitions protesting annexation to the United States. We had anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 people a day fly out to Hawaii Island, drove an hour at least to one of the most remote parts of this island, to the most uncomfortable weather conditions that can be found almost anywhere in the world. You go from extreme cold to extreme heat in a matter of minutes. You like in the same day you can risk frostbite and heat exhaustion. And people came in the middle of the week. They left their jobs, they left their families, because they were called by something more powerful than logic, more powerful than the law, more powerful than like the politics of it all. They were called by their people. And they saw their people standing in the image of their stories, of their songs, of their teachings. And so what I really want us to key in, I'm running out of time, but, you know, up until the COVID health crisis that necessitated we move home, our people continued to govern that space. And we did so in strict kapu aloha. We had our own philosophy of genuine security and care that enveloped that place. And so that means in less than a year while we were up there, our movement had brought thousands of people to that mountain physically, and perhaps over 1 million virtually. And most of these protectors had never stood in the shade of this mountain before, which means that's thousands of people who never had the opportunity to develop an intimate relationship to one of our most sacred ʻāina, and that is intentional, right? The settler state almost necessitates our disconnection, not just from each other, but from our sacred places. And so one of the real beauties and powers of this movement is we disrupted that disconnection, and we said, this is our Mauna. We're going to come develop a relationship with her. And so in doing that, we cultivated in our people an intimacy that we had been strategically estranged from, and then we gave our people something back, right? That was taken away. And I think this is one of the things we're learning now, that our people around the world are reconnecting not just to our Mauna, not just to our waters, but we're taking these lessons of aloha and intimacy to our other homes and communities. This movement and the sacrifice of our elders prepared us for this kind of commitment. And this is why I think these stories are so important, because we look at how there are these similar lines of connection between what was happening on the Mauna in 2014 and 2015, and then what happened at Standing Rock in 2016, and then what happened back again on the Mauna in 2019, and Line 3, and of course across the territories now occupied by the Canadian government, that there are all these similar lines of connection. And one of the greatest things, I think, those of us who actually have the opportunity to show up to those spaces, one of the greatest things we learn is how much we love each other, how much we will not forsake each other. And so that's the idea I want to leave us with. I want us to celebrate the ways that our people are returning to liberatory movements and Indigenous knowledge in ways that are not just political and not just logical, but are deeply intimate and emotional. And in fact, that it is our growing intimacy shared between each other and our ʻāina that is our greatest wealth. And I think if COVID has demonstrated anything, it's that. It's how important it is that we remain not just connected, but deeply committed to each other's well-being and the aloha we share with each other. I want to also end by saying, you know, in May of 2021, the Canadian government pledged to not support the TMT without the consent of the Native people, but it's unclear what that means, since they also, we have so strongly demonstrated we don't give consent, and yet Canada hasn't formally revoked its financial support. So there's a tension there that I think can be exploited for folks who may want to ask, like, what can we do to support this work? We know that this announcement will make way for further attempts by the TMT Corporation to kind of manufacture Native consent. So we need to be really vigilant of that. 2 weeks ago, my own university published a Maunakea management document entitled E O Ikaleo, which means listen to the voice, where they continue to make way for the possibility of the construction of the TMT development. Another reminder that universities are generally not very good listeners if you look at the top, going from the top down. And this past week, the TMT Corporation also announced they would delay the project for 2 years while they, quote, heal their relationship with the community. Our community, like many other Native communities around the world who are fighting off against their own settler states and massive corporations, continue to reject insincere moves towards cooperation. We have no intention of collaborating in the desecration of our land and sovereignty. We have made that stance abundantly clear, that there will be no further development on our sacred sites, including our Mauna a Wākea. And I really do believe that there will be a day when we remove every single one of these telescopes, just as I strongly believe that we will deoccupy and demilitarize our territories. Just as I believe our comrades across Turtle Island, Oceania, and the world will continue the unrelenting pursuit of freedom and liberation from white supremacist settler states. But deoccupation and the collapse of capitalism and settler colonialism will not be enough if we don't also commit to bringing our lahui, our peoples, together to our sacred places again, so that we can remember our aloha for each other. So kind of in closing, I want to implore all of us to do that important emotional work as teachers, as students, to do the work that is actually going to build intimacy, not just build, the critical thinking is necessary, but the ability to think emotionally, the ability to articulate that gut knowledge is critical. And so if our reasons to support, you know, the protection of Maunakea or defunding of the police or the blocking of a pipeline is just logical and political, I urge you to take the time to go visit these places and these people, develop an intimacy with them and the people giving their lives to protect them. Go fall in love with your mountains, your rivers, your oceans. Go fall in love with your people again. Because it wasn't just our right to self-determine how we manage our resources that was taken away by colonialism and occupation. It was most of all our relationships to each other and our land. And it's essential we take that pilina back. And if for any reason, you know, COVID or all the other reasons that you cannot make the pilgrimage to your sacred places, I encourage you to gather your families and play your sacred songs, tell your stories together, sing them over and over until every part of your body remembers, until every one of your descendants refuses to forget. That is all I have for you folks today. Mahalo.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Nimitsmo Tlasokamati. It was a beautiful talk. I can't even talk. It's so, your words are really beautiful, and my skin is, how do you call it? Chicken skin?
Yes, that's what we call it.
Chicken skin. And I think I remember you saying, if you write something and you don't feel, if there's no reaction, the poem is, I don't remember you using the
Useless.
word useless. So it was not useless, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
I have my copy and I'm finishing. So thank you for, as a mestizex quilontli, as a mestizo indigenous queer, I am really thankful for it. It's such a gift, and your words really touch home. And I laughed and I cried, and I challenged myself to thinking, how am I really connecting with the fight that is going on in my own territories? So one of the questions that I have is, you mentioned in your book and in the talk, how do you envision educators cultivating puʻohonua, a place of refuge? And in your book, you say, a gathering for indigenous queers like myself to see ourselves unapologetically represented in literatures and histories. How can educators cultivate this place of refuge inside their classrooms? What would that look like for you?
Absolutely. Mahalo. That's such a great question. I love the puʻohonua as a model of something that we can build anywhere we go. And I think the first step, so maybe I'll take you back to how we established the puʻohonua. The first way we consecrated our puʻohonua is we went and we engaged in, sorry, my dad's singing and it's loud. We actually walked the lines of the territory, and we were led in ceremony where someone was chanting a chant called He Mu'oia, and that chant calls out the violence and the eha, the bad things that have been done, the desecration that has been done at a certain place, and removes it. Like, it acknowledges it and it removes it. And so I think about, how does that model work in the classroom, right? For those of us who are empowered to teach at any stage of learning, there's so much in the curriculum that we've been offered. There's so much in the things that we've learned throughout our schooling that are continuing to cause harm in the classroom, right? Even if it's not intending to cause harm. So I think the first way we develop puʻohonua in our classroom is we really need to take a critical look at our own curriculum. What are we teaching? Who are the voices that we are allowing to speak in our classroom, right? Like, what are the films and the stories that will speak to our students? And how can we be more critical about that material and our approach to teaching that material, so that we can, like, acknowledge the harm that's probably still existing and then remove it, and then say, like, what we're going to do different to care for this space. So that's one thing I think on a curriculum tip. But in addition to that, a puʻohonua is by definition a place where people should feel safe. And so that's going to look different depending on who are the people in the room. And you also have to be aware of who's being excluded from that space. And those kinds of answers, there's no clear-cut answers on how to, like, create genuine security and safety. I know this for sure, you know, as a queer and indigenous person, that looks different in different places. but I think always that's going to require first, like, taking a long look in the mirror in terms of the ways that you are either creating places that will cultivate connection, cultivate care, versus perpetuating spaces that will cultivate fear and harm. And it's not so simple as distilling it down just to the words that we say as educators. It has everything to do with every bit of material we bring into our classroom. And then, of course, most of us know, right, that the classroom is an extension of the community. So then we also have to, like, go and do that work in the community. If our children are hungry at home, they're hungry in the classroom. So that's our work too, right? If the children are not cared for at home because, I don't know, their community is over policed and over incarcerated, then that's our problem too as educators. That's something that we shouldn't consent to, not in our name, right? So the pu'uhonua has to extend beyond the walls of the classroom.
Thank you for that. And I got really excited. So just to tell the audience, I initiated the Q&A with a few questions, and I'll be taking some questions in the chat. So we encourage you to type your questions. A question from Leah from the audience that has to do with what you were saying is, she was thinking about how the word violence was used in this talk to describe the development on the sacred mountain. Would it be possible to alternatively use the words disrespect, dishonor, abuse, and harm for the development on your mountain?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You know, as a poet, I think, and as a Hawaiian, I think there's a tremendous power in language and articulation. I think harm certainly works. There's an association with violence that's really important. There is a perpetrator of that violence, right? There is someone causing that harm, but also violence is something we think of that happens to people, right? And you can only think of it only happening to people if you separate people from our environment and from our more than human kin. And so I particularly think the word violence works really well. A lot of those other terms I think can be useful, but I think disrespect, sorry, the question's gone, so I don't see the other examples anymore. Oh yeah, disrespect, dishonor. I personally don't think there's strong enough words to describe the desecration that is taking place. But ultimately that's going to be up to, I think the words we use are ultimately going to be up to the people who are closest to those spaces, right? So I wouldn't enforce my own language choices to folks at Standing Rock and talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, who may want to use different words, but yeah, I think that's what I would say to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah.
You mentioned, like, as a poet, can you speak of the importance of embodied poetry or performative art and artivism for decolonial futures?
Yes, the importance of embodied poetry. You know, so much of, I think, our work, like the work of our generation, is in bringing all these theories and these stories back into the body. Whether it is performing songs that are long forgotten, stories and songs that are long forgotten, or reinterpreting them into our own voice. It is an important reminder to our audiences and to our opponents that we are talking about something that is intimately connected to us, that we are in fact both the protectors and we are the mountain itself, that these things are connected. And so I think, you know, I think poetry and music and story do that, communicate that so much better than anything else, right? Leading up to, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, in my early years in paying attention to the struggle, I was really paying attention to kind of those legal questions, those political questions, and I could have given a presentation that just talked about like all the laws and the rules that were being broken, but that doesn't really speak to people. That's not going to give you chicken skin, right? That's not going to make you think about your own territory. But when we sing a song by a young man who grew up living in the magnificent shade of a mountain, and it shaped his entire experience so much that even when he is 1,000 miles away, he can see the mountain on the horizon. That's going to make you think about your mountain, right? Or that's going to make you think about your river. And in that, you are now connected to this struggle, and you and I, sitting in this, even in this virtual space, you and I have resonance between each other, right? Now we are connected, and now I care about what you care about. And I think that's what poetry and music does. It creates a different kind of intimacy that honestly the traditional academy has tried very hard to like keep out of our work. And so we need the artists to keep like reminding us of that.
Thank you. A question from our audience. In your own words, could you define alohaina?
Yes, alohaina. I would first say alohaina means love for the land, but the most poignant definition for me of alohaina means that everything I learned about how to love the people around me, I learned from land. And so in order to be a better lover, in order to be a better comrade, in order to be a better partner, I need to go better steward the land that feeds me. And to me, that's what alohaina is.
And I think it ties really well with our next question. Reflecting on your poem, Rise Like a Mighty Wave, you write inside your book, perhaps we should also remember we are not simply standing in opposition to desecration. Rather, we are fearlessly committed to protecting our humanity and our ability to live, breathe, think, and act as our kupuna have for generations. Do you have any suggestions? And I know you said that a little bit at the end of your talk, but do you have any more suggestions for non-Indigenous people specifically to not only stand in radical solidarity and become, as you say, comrades, but also commit to re-embody and practice alohaina?
Absolutely. So this is the question I get a lot, and I think it's an important question because it demonstrates how so many people are trying to find a way to live in good relation, both fellow Indigenous people and our allied settlers who are living in our territories. And I'll take us back to the definition of alohaina, right? I said ʻāina taught me everything about love, and alohaina means that in order to love the land, you have to love the people of the land. And in order to love the people of the land, you have to love the land. And so for those of us who are not living in our native territories for whatever reason, maybe we're American or Canadian settlers, or maybe we are climate refugees and we cannot return to our homeland. Maybe we are the descendants of this intergenerational diaspora. I think the first step is, in order to connect to and this is something that goes wrong a lot in Hawaii, because people think, oh, I want to love and care for Hawaii, so I'm just going to go straight to the land and like fix the land. But you're taking the native people out of that context, which is a violence in and of itself. So if you want to be in good relationship with land, you need to find ways to be good in relationship with native people of those lands. So the first step is to figure out who are the native stewards of the territories you're living in. That is something everyone can do, regardless of your ethnic or racial background. And luckily, a lot of that information is available online. There are like maps, you can look up who the traditional stewards of your territory are. And once you find those people or identify those people, then you need to put yourself in service to those people, and put yourself in service to their vision for whatever their vision for the deoccupied, decolonial, anti-oppressive future is, right? I can't give that answer from Hawaii, what that's going to look like in BC, right? But I can tell you that anywhere you go, there are native people who are still there. And to live in alignment with alohaina tells us we go find those people first and we follow their lead.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Dr. Gala asks in the chat, can you share with us how you maintain your strength as a Kanaka Maoli while working in an institution that struggles to acknowledge Kanaka histories, knowledges, relationships? Your story can help many of us who are Indigenous community members, but also scholar educators who are working within these institutions, our traditional homelands or our other traditional lands, working to build decolonial futures. Mahalo.
This is a wonderful question. I'm really lucky that I feel really blessed to be born in the generation that I was blessed in, and that I grew up watching folks like my father, Jonathan Osorio, Haunani K. Trask, Lili Kalaka Me'ele Hiva, some of the like giants in Hawaiian scholarship, really come into their own as I was a child. And so I saw what it looked like to be a Hawaiian scholar in the university, and I immediately associated, oh, if you work at the university, half of your time is spent protesting the university. That's just what you do. That's the job. You know, and I went to a Hawaiian language immersion school where half of our field trips were trips down to the state capitol to protest for more funds to support our school. So, you know, some people may say like, oh, that's so unfortunate. You spent your whole life fighting, but I think it was a really important way to kind of frame to me what the world was going to be like as a Hawaiian scholar if I chose to take that path. So none of this was surprising, you know, when I came in as a student and I, for the first time, felt that harm directed towards me. I would say the best ways we maintain strength, and it's going to sound kind of, you know, like a broken record here, but the best way we maintain strength is we create community with each other. We are not meant to live these lives alone. We are meant to go through struggle as community. And so some of us will be in departments where there are very few Native people, perhaps no people of our same tribes or territories. And so we need to find ways to build coalition with other folks who are being similarly impacted by our institutions. And so we find those folks who are our comrades, then we find those mentors. There's few of them, unfortunately, because we are underrepresented as faculty. We are certainly well underrepresented as administrators, but we find the folks who will have our backs, and we build those communities out by ourselves, because the truth is, it is very hard to survive these institutions alone. That is intentional. That violence is meant to keep us out. And so even creating friendship, creating community, that's an act of radical resurgence in the university system that we need to practice.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. Trauma in experience of fighting for our ʻāina is seen in so many ways. How do we as Lahui try to get others to understand our fight or plight? Education is most important. What resources can you offer for me, for those who aren't aware?
Yeah, so I've found, you know, depending on where we are situated, right, as a Hawaiian, I have the privilege of, you know, being in Hawaii and working in Hawaii, so I get to center these stories of struggle that are on Hawaiians, because that's this ʻāina that we're in. But when I've lived elsewhere, I lived in California for 4 years in Ohlone territory, and I lived in New York in Lenape territory for a year. And what I found is most useful actually in those situations is to do my homework to understand the struggles of the Native people of those places, right? And when I really commit to that knowledge, then I can see the connections, right? The connections become really clear. And that's where we kind of meet in that circle to share our shared experience of colonialism, of trauma, but also our shared vision for the future. And that's where we conspire for those movements, I think. Yes, education is incredibly important, but in order to educate our friends, we need to make sure that we're educated on what is most important to them as well. So I kind of like that approach.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And I wanted to ask about, can you speak, in your book, you speak a lot of these, of the term queer and queering, and you use it as in your Indigenous queer theory in your theoretical framework. Can you speak of the need for queering some Indigenous tradition knowledges that are seen as ancestral and authentic in order to remember our intimacies?
Yes. So this is like a huge tension in the book because I am a queer person and because I do practice relationships that others identify as queer, right? I have a same-sex partner. And so that comes under kind of this designation. But it was really important to me in the book that I not apply new language and theories to elders who may not have identified with that, right? So there was a need to really spend the time sharing about all these different relationships that are taking place in the moʻolelo, in the stories, and how that offers a complete different framework for understanding relationships, period, right? So it is not so much what's interesting and empowering about the story for some of us is going to be those queer relationships, those relationships we see as queer, because they're mirrors, right? And they represent for us an ability to be seen in our history, and not just seen, but fully celebrated in our history and in the teachings of our ancestors, which I'm sure any Indigenous queer person sitting in this space can identify that they needed to see that, see themselves in that history. So that's really important to a lot of us. But it's also really important that we use that entry to turn upside down the basic notions we have about relationships, period, right? So rather than trying to find a way to show people all the ways that my ancestors were queer, really just demonstrate, like, let me show you all the ways that we just weren't straight and we don't fit into that framework. And this language, even, and thinking about centering sexuality so much is so limiting, because what we really want to talk about is how to live in good relation. And staying on the like straight, gay, binary, the focus on sexuality really gets away from the fact that what I really want to talk about is, again, like land, desire, and pleasure, and how that's all connected to like the desire and pleasure we give to each other. And of course, there's work in the book that talks about, you know, how that relates to governance, how that relates to, you know, what we consider our family, how that relates to capitalism or our fight against capitalism. But ultimately what I'd really just love is for us to be able to return to our stories and just see how differently we have lived in this world before, as permission to live differently once again and not feel so trapped in this horrible arrangement we've been pushed into. And I think that's one of the real great values of kind of a queer analytic or an Indigenous queer theory that really pushes us to see beyond.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. That was wonderful talking to you.
And my thanks to Dr. Osorio for joining us as the first speaker in our Transformative Education Speaker Series. I want to encourage everyone watching this now or later to go out and purchase her book. I can't wait to read it myself, and I'm so grateful to you for offering your time and your teachings to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keenan, and everyone for having me. It was a pleasure.
Enjoy your evening, everyone.